Hi, I'm Christopher Wolfe. I'm co-director of the Thomas International Center, and welcome to our first course in our online core curriculum. The Thomas International Center hopes to put online a whole series of classes that represent the core curriculum of a Catholic university. And one integral element of that core curriculum will be a course on man living together with other people in society. What Aristotle would call politics, what today we call more broadly the social sciences, which would probably include sociology and economics. We're going to be focusing especially on government in this course. And to do so, we're going to actually break up the course into a number of different parts. And so we're going to break up that entire class into 5 short courses. And each short course will be a component of the overall full developed class. The first will be one on the ends of government, the purposes of government. What is it the government is supposed to accomplish? And for this, we'll look especially at the Declaration of Independence, for reasons I'll discuss in a few moments. Second, we'll be looking at basic constitutional principles, especially as they were understood by the founders when they wrote the Constitution. Third, we'll be talking about the changing constitutional principles over time. And there'll be a number of components here. One will be the formal changes, amendments to the Constitution. There'll be some informal changes, such as the development of parties. And then third, there'll be the changes, the evolution of the basic constitutional principles themselves. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Principles like federalism and separation of powers, constitutionalism, and the extended republic. Then the fourth short course will be on changing purposes of American government. This will talk especially about changing ideas of equality, racial, economic, gender equality, and then also changing notions of liberty as well with respect to religion, free speech, and privacy. And we'll see that changing purposes of government may help to account for the changing of the basic purposes themselves, how they've been modified or evolved throughout American history. Then the fifth short course will be on democracy and the American way of life. Drawing especially on Alexis de Tocqueville, we'll try to see how it is that living in a modern liberal democracy, based especially on equality of condition, will lead people to be a certain kind of person. There's how we think, what our feelings are, what our customs are. These are things, Tocqueville argues, that are influenced by the kind of political regime, the kind of political community in which we live. So these are the 5 components of the overall fully developed course on American constitutional principles, which is the first of these courses in our online curriculum. Our first short course is going to be on the goals of government and the Declaration of Independence. We'll start by looking at the Declaration because it provides us with a good idea of what the framers of American government were trying to accomplish when they wrote the Constitution. They had in mind some goal of government they were trying to achieve, and the Declaration gives us a pretty good idea of what that is. In addition, we'll then look at what the transition from the Declaration to the Constitution was, and especially the first, perhaps failed attempt to achieve the goal under the Articles of Confederation. And then we'll also look at a little bit of the background to the Constitution by turning to the Constitutional Convention of 1787 to see the people and the events of that convention. What are the purposes of government? What is it that government is trying to achieve? And for this, we're fortunate, actually, to be able to look at the very first document of American government. Many governments didn't start at a particular point in time. Some governments, their origins are lost in the mists of time. They didn't really start at any single given point. With America, it's quite distinctive. At a definite point in time, the founders decided that it was necessary to separate from the mother country. And the result is we can actually put a date on when the United States began, on July 4th, 1776. And also interesting about the Declaration is that it's a very practical document. It does do something very specific and practical, which is to say, we, the United Colonies, the United States of America, are now an independent entity, an independent country. We're no longer part of Great Britain. But it didn't have just a practical purpose. It also had an unusually theoretical component as well. And this doesn't happen very often in history. But the founders were thoughtful men, well-educated men, and on this really historic occasion, they decided we really have to state clearly what it is that we conceive the purpose of government to be. And they laid it out in the document. So that makes the Declaration a very unusual document. It's a real advantage that the founders have actually laid out what they think the purposes of government are, because that gives us some kind of handle for evaluating the government, right? If we want to understand whether a hammer is a good hammer, well, we have a certain purpose in mind. It's to pound in nails, right? Or if we want to evaluate what's a good car, that's more complex. It's how you can get a vehicle that will take us from one place to another safely, efficiently. But we have some kind of purpose in mind when we evaluate. Well, the same thing is true more generally of government. You know, the founders ultimately are going to create the U.S. Constitution, you know, a very specific form of government. But we have to ask ourselves the question, what were they trying to accomplish when they wrote the Constitution? The Constitution is fundamentally a means to an end. What is that end? And I think, as I've said, that end is laid out in the Declaration of Independence. And so we want to turn to that document now. Now, it may be that many of you have not read the Declaration of Independence for a long time. It's not a very long document. I might suggest that you pause this video now and hop online or grab a book that has a copy of it and reread the Declaration of Independence. It's only a few pages, and you can get through it pretty quickly. Okay? So let's start off with a summary of the document. That is, I want to give you some kind of feel for the outline or the structure of the Declaration of Independence, and then we can go from there to a much more detailed analysis of one part of the Declaration that's of particular interest, given our concern, to find out what the purposes of government were. And that section is the section on the self-evident principles. Okay, so let's begin with the Declaration, get an idea of what the outline or structure of the document is. There are basically four parts. The first part is the introduction. It sets up the issue. It says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the bonds which have heretofore tied it with another, then a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they should set forth their reasons. And that's a really interesting opening, because it suggests that it's not just the practical document of, hey, we want to get this done. It's basically saying, you know, the whole world cares about what we're doing. I mean, what we're doing matters not just to ourselves, but in the history of mankind. And that reflected the fact that they understood that they were establishing a new kind of government. And so this is something that's really big on the stage of world history. And so they have to lay out what the reasons are. Note that they said one people, has to lay out its reasons if they're going to dissolve their bands with another. That means they think that already they're one people, even though they haven't declared independence yet. Why is it that they're one people? That's actually something that Federalist number 2 discusses, and it goes through a lot of the different elements that provide a unity to the original 13 colonies. One, obviously, is language. Sharing the same language is important because it facilitates communication. Second of all, a common history. most Americans came from England, although of course there were Americans from other parts of Europe as well at the time. And so there's still a fair amount of history in common. Most of them, as British descendants, are familiar with British history, including British constitutional history. And so that provides something in common. There's a common religion. Americans, by and large, were Protestant Christians, and there were some denominational differences, but at least in its broad outlines, they shared a common religion. Of course, they had the actual experience of working together. This is 1776, and already for a number of years now, there have been a lot of tensions with the British. There's been fighting, and so already now they've started to act together. And therefore, well, it's a short one, they have a common history, not just the individual histories of the different colonies. So the founders are saying we're already one people, and we're simply now declaring the implications of that by establishing our independence. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now, what we're making a claim to is to having a separate and independent station among the nations of the world. And they argue that this is something to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle us to. That is, it's not just a kind of practical assertion of power that we want this and so we're going to do it. They're basically arguing there's an order to the universe, an order to nature, presided over by some kind of deity, a God known by natural theology. And so the founders believed that there was a natural order that really sustained the argument that they're going to make about the right that we have to a position as an independent nation. Okay, so that's setting up the issue, setting up the question. It's basically saying we're going to declare why we're declaring our independence. Now here's where something interesting happens. There's a shift in the whole tone of the Declaration when it goes into the second section. That second section is the self-evident principles. And in some ways it almost sounds like a university class in political philosophy. The founders kind of step back, they're looking at the whole of political life, and they're laying down these fundamental principles which regulate political life. So what are these self-evidence principles? They say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Governments are instituted among men to secure these rights, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government. And it's the right of the people to alter or abolish the government if they think it's not doing what it's supposed to do, if they think they need to establish a new government which will effectuate their safety and happiness. So these are the self-evident principles of the Declaration. And we'll come back and look at those in much greater detail. After elaborating these self-evident principles, there's a kind of connecting link before the next section, and that's this. We've established that there's a right to alter or abolish government, that the American people have a right to establish a new government. But even if there's a right, we have to recognize that this is not something to be used lightly. It's necessary to exercise prudence in the exercise of this right. Why? Well, just think about for a moment what happens when you have a revolution. I mean, this is something that involves a lot of change. Obviously, in our case, in the case of the circumstances of 1776, it was going to involve a war with Great Britain because they weren't lightly going to let us just declare our independence. They wanted to retain control over us. And so the result is war. And in a war, a lot of bad things happen. And so you don't lightly undertake this step of declaring independence and even fighting a war of independence to establish that. So there's a comment here that human beings in general are inclined not to exercise that right unless they really, really have to, that they're often willing to put up with a lot of pain, a lot of suffering. And there's almost a sense that people are a little bit too willing sometimes to put up with unjust government rather than really doing what they should, I think Jefferson suggests, which is to actually assert their rights if their rulers are abusing their powers. So there's a kind of caution. We have to exercise prudence, and that prudence will tell us only if there's really a long train of abuses, something really tyrannical, should we go to the point of actually engaging in war and declaring our independence. And we'll put up with certain kinds of particular injustices. If something unjust is done here or there, we can put up with that. But when you see a kind of pattern, an overall pattern that suggests that there's an attempt to reduce you to subjection, that a tyrannical force is going to be exercised over you, at that point, prudence says, hey, listen, we have to assert ourselves. We have to assert our independence. Okay. And they say in the next sentences, this is what's happened with us. We've been really patient. We've put up with a lot of particular injustices. But what we have here really is a real pattern of injustice that really makes it necessary for us to exercise this power to alter or abolish our government. And at this point, we're about 1/3 of the way through the Declaration of Independence. And most of the rest, most of the other 2/3 of the Declaration, is actually laying out the case. Now, there's something of a shift here. The self-evident principles tend to be very universal. They sound like they apply really to all politics, to all peoples over time. Now we're moving from that to a discussion of a bill of particulars. We've been part of the British Empire, and as Englishmen, we have certain rights of Englishmen, and we can appeal to those rights to show, well, this has been violated, that's been violated, and that's how we can figure out that there's this overall pattern that leads in the direction of tyranny. So what is this actual bill of particulars? Well, we're not going to go into that in great detail. We'll just mention a few things. The first thing is actually a series of acts by the King of England. And then there'll be a second part where it talks about the king joining with others in order to do certain things. And then there'll be a third part talking about our British brethren more generally. Now, why does the Declaration start with the King of England? It has to do with a certain constitutional theory that Jefferson had put forth a couple of years earlier. The sense in England was that the American colonies are simply subject to the mother country, and that means to the king and Parliament as well. By this time, it's after the Glorious Revolution at the end of the 17th century, and the king has a lot of power, but after the Glorious Revolution, he has it primarily by his control over Parliament. Interestingly, the colonists don't start with the Parliament. Why? It's because they had developed this theory that was based on the fact that these colonists had crossed an ocean. They had, set up, communities in this new territory, and they had also developed their own political bodies, including legislative bodies. So it raises the question, what's the relationship between these new legislatures in the colonies and the legislatures back in England? Jefferson's argument, starting a couple of years before the Declaration, involved a constitutional theory something like this. The king was somebody who was over the whole British Empire. And then you had the British Parliament representing certain people, namely the people of the British Isles. But there were already legislatures in the colonies representing the people of the colonies. And so the king is over everybody. He's the one who connects the different parts of the empire. But Parliament doesn't have jurisdiction over the colonies. It has jurisdiction over the British Isles. And then the legislatures of the colonies are the ones that truly represent the people of those colonies. The result is that if there's a problem in our relationship with the British Empire, it doesn't really have so much to do with Parliament. It has to do with that person through whom we are connected with the empire, namely the British King, King George. Okay, so the condemnation of the actions of Britain begins by focusing on the king, because he's the connecting link. And it goes through a variety of acts that the king has performed. So, for example, he has dealt with the legislatures by refusing to assent to laws, because in effect, the king has a kind of veto over the laws passed by the colonial legislatures. He sometimes called the legislatures into sessions far away from where they ordinarily meet. There are problems with the judiciary, that certain kinds of judges are appointed who are really acting really at the behest of the king rather than acting impartially. There's a whole series of things that the king has done. He has sent over swarms of officers. This is something perhaps familiar to us today. Swarms of officials who are really unnecessary and are very expensive. He has done things with respect to the military and civil power, not letting the military power be effectively controlled by the civil power, especially the civil power in the colonies. So for a whole series of reasons, the king has violated his constitutional trust, because the king is always supposed to operate within certain rights of Englishmen that forms a kind of unwritten constitution. Now, after going through the Bill of Goods against the king, it goes through a series of things that he has done with others in pretended acts of legislation. That is, here it refers to Parliament. And Parliament has done a variety of things which are unacceptable, including regulating our trade in ways that are unjust, for example. Then finally, we have also appealed in a way beyond the political officials, beyond the king and beyond the Parliament, to our British brethren, the people of England more generally. And they too, the Declaration says, have been deaf to our pleas, in effect, pleas that Britain live up to the requirements of the unwritten English Constitution in their treatment of the colonies. So the bottom line, after going through this long bill of particulars, is that we really are, we Americans, are really subject to a very unjust kind of jurisdiction, unjust legislation, unjust executive actions. And there's a broad enough pattern here that really what it suggests is that we're being subjected to a tyranny. And this section ends with a real focus on the king again, saying a prince like this is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. And we'll come back to the importance of that later on. So that's really the bulk of the Declaration, in some ways not the part that has stood the test of time, you might say, in terms of the familiarity of people with it. Most of us tend to focus especially on the self-evident principles for reasons that we'll see. So at this point, we now transition to the fourth and last section of the Declaration, which is the conclusion. Having concluded that the king is really not fit to be our ruler, we formally declare our independence. And it's interesting, a couple of invocations here of divine providence. And again, I'll come back to discussing why that's important in terms of the original understanding of the relationship between religion and politics. We assert that we're now a nation, that we have the ordinary powers that nations have to declare war, to make treaties, to regulate commerce. And we finally conclude with a kind of commitment. The framers really commit to each other, and in a way I guess they're calling on the people to commit as well, their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor in order to uphold the principles of this document. So there you have the Declaration, a kind of outline, an introductory part, and then the self-evident principles, a little bit less than a third of the document, about 2/3 of the document focusing on the Bill of Particulars, showing why it is that the things that have been done in England violate the rights of Englishmen in so consistent a pattern that we have a right to declare our independence, and then the last part actually formally declaring that independence. So now that we've looked at the outline, the structure of the Declaration of Independence and seen its major parts, next class we'll turn to a very close examination of the self-evident principles of the Declaration, which will give us a key to what the founders thought American government was supposed to do.